Hi everyone, we'll just wait for a few extras to join us on today's webinar. Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for a few extra people to join. Looks like the numbers are ticking up quite well, so we'll just be another minute or so. All right, well, we might start things. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today on our webinar looking at avoiding the 11th hour crush and the imminent cessation of LIBOR. We hope this will assist you in confirming what you want to do to finalise your transition readiness and determine your options around active transition sooner rather than later to avoid the 11th hour crush. My name is Nathan Gooley and I'm the executive sponsor for the Benchmarks program here at NAB. Just before I ask Lisa to take us through some housekeeping matters, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I meet with you today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are today for this meeting, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that gather with us today. Okay, Lisa, over to you for some housekeeping and then before we get into it.
Thank you, Nathan. So yes, as Nathan mentioned, we do have some points we need to inform you of before we begin. As you may have noticed, you're automatically muted, and that will be the case for the duration of this webinar for the purpose of avoiding any background noise. And we have also, just for noting, have time devoted at the end of the session to answer any questions you may have. Now, to submit your questions, can you please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question in there any time during the webinar. I'll then, after those questions have been submitted, at the end of the session, we'll present the questions to the panel for them to be answered. Now, this webinar is being recorded for your reference as well. I'd also like to draw your attention to the important notices and disclaimers on the material that will be covered in this session that you will get at the end of the webinar. We'll send out a version of this presentation, and the content we will go through is general information only, and it's not intended to be comprehensive, nor can it constitute investment, legal, accounting, hedge accounting, or tax advice. So back to you, Nathan.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And today's presentation, we've put it in three components before we move to Q&A. First up, Nelda Turnbull, who is NAB's corporate institutional legal expert on benchmark reform. Nelda will provide an update on Australia's lending documentation and credit adjustment considerations. Next up will be Ross Beeney, who is the benchmark reform lead subject matter expert, who will take us on what you will need to think about with the loss of LIBOR benchmarks and LIBOR product retirement. And I'll bring us home looking at what you need to do to cover off some of the risks and avoid the 11th hour crush in the fourth quarter. And after that, we'll move through to a panel Q&A. So I might hand over to you, Nelda, to get things underway.
Thanks, Nathan. Hi, everyone. As Nathan said, my name is Nelda Turnbull and I'm a lawyer here at NAB. I'm really excited. Today is my first day in the new building here at NAB in Carrington Place. I don't know if they call it Carrington Place or Carrington Street. I'm still going to investigate, but I'll always remember that I did this webinar for you today on my first day in this building. Okay, so the first two slides I'm going to look at is going to set the scene for you, just things that you should already know, but just refresh your memory. Let's look at the first slide, is the dates that we're all working towards, namely the dates that LIBOR will no longer be available. The UK Financial Conduct Authority, or the FCA, made an announcement in March of this year stating the dates on which the various LIBOR settings will either cease to be published or cease to be representative of their underlying market. Let's first look at the rates which will cease to be published. The slide includes the dates, for example, that on 31 December 2021, the 1 week and 2 month US dollar LIBOR, as well as overnight 1 week, 2 months and 12 month sterling LIBOR settings will cease to be published. And this means that after 31 December 2021, it's expected that these LIBOR settings simply won't exist anymore because they won't be published. And from 30 June, of course, 30 June 2023, the same can be said for the ceasing US dollar LIBOR settings. So what about those LIBOR settings where publications not ceased? Even though cessation dates for these often used 3 and 6 month sterling, JPY and US dollar LIBOR settings have not been specified, we cannot continue to use these after the date specified for their loss of representativeness without restriction. The FCA may not have specified a date for their publication to cease, but they did say that these settings will become unrepresentative of the underlying market. And you will see from the slide that the unrepresentativeness is from 31 December 2021 for the relevant sterling and JPY LIBOR settings, and 30 June 2023 for the relevant US dollar LIBOR settings. So when does the benchmark actually become unrepresentative? The benchmark becomes unrepresentative not on the date of the FCA statement in March, but on the future date specified by the FCA on which it will become unrepresentative. And what's the consequence of a LIBOR setting becoming unrepresentative? Rates that are unrepresentative can continue to exist. They're likely to become known as synthetic LIBOR. But we shouldn't get all too excited. It will have very limited use case scenarios and will only likely be able to be used in existing contracts, which qualifies tough legacy contracts. So contracts where there's genuinely no prospect of amending it, and it won't be available for use in new contracts. Synthetic LIBOR has been mentioned as a potential for the 1, 3 and 6 month sterling, JPY and the US dollar LIBOR settings. It is unfortunate that for the sterling and JPY settings, which become unrepresentative at the end of this year, there's still no certainty as to what will qualify as tough legacy contracts. There is a current consultation on foot by the FCA, and that will need to be completed, and further announcements are required by the FCA on this. So our view is definitely not to rely on tough legacy solutions unless you absolutely have to. If you can actively transition, then rather do that and do not wait for synthetic LIBOR to be finalized. At NAB, we're keeping our eye on the suggested solutions, making sure we will understand which of our contracts may be affected by this so that we're not caught off guard, but we are continuing our transition planning independently of these potential synthetic LIBORs. Also important to note before we move on is that this FCA announcement, of course, also constituted the index cessation event under the ESTA benchmark supplement and protocol and triggers the fixing of the spread adjustment. We'll look at the spread adjustment in a bit more detail a bit later throughout this session. So how does the announcement impact your loan agreements? Well, that depends on the terms of the loan agreement and what version of the LMA or APLMA documents your loan may be based on, if it is based on that. We should all be familiar with the replacement and fallback clauses in our agreements to understand the impact these types of announcements do have on our loan agreements. And there's unfortunately not a one-size-fits-all answer for the impact on that. Let's look at the next slide. So this one again is just another bit of history or a bit of basic knowledge that you should be aware of. It's and it's an important concept. It's the difference between a term rate like LIBOR and a risk-free rate like SONIA or SOFR, which will replace the LIBOR benchmarks. A risk-free rate is fundamentally different to term rates. This slide summarizes the differences between these two types of rates. The main differences being a term rate is a forward-looking rate set daily for a range of interest periods, for example, 1 week or 3 month LIBOR settings. Interest is also known at the start of an interest period, and the interest includes a term bank credit or liquidity premium, which reflect the cost and risk to the banks of lending over a term period. A risk-free rate, on the other hand, is a backward-looking rate. which means it's not known at the start of an interest period. It's also overnight, meaning it has no term structure and does not include the bank credit or liquidity premium. Because of these because of the differences in these two types of rates, new concepts have been introduced, such as the conventions that have been created for the calculation of an RFR to ensure that the interest payable can be known before the end of the interest period. And you may have heard the words simple look back or observation shift, and Ross will go through these a bit later in more detail and explain to you what these are. I can note that these apply equally to loans and derivatives. Sorry, I'm not in control of the slides. Lisa, can you just go back? Not yet, I'll tell you when. Because of these differences in the two types of rates, I've told you about the new concepts that's been developed for the calculation. So another new concept is the credit adjustment spread, or the CAS. The CAS is to deal with the fact that the RFR does not price in the term credit risk premium. So an adjustment is made when you transition a LIBOR-based transaction by including an additional spread on top of your existing margin to cover these risks previously covered in the term rate. And why is it necessary to include the CAS? Well, it's necessary to ensure fair conversion of existing contracts. Whilst the discontinuation of LIBOR should not be used to move existing contracts to higher rates, banks or other parties currently receiving interest payments based on LIBOR are equally also not expected to give up the adjustment spread or that term credit adjustment, term credit included in LIBOR that they were expecting. Ultimately, this means that each party should be in a similar economic position before and after the transition. Thanks, Lisa. Now we can go to the next slide. Because the risk-free rate does not include this credit element to reflect the cost and risk to banks of lending over a term period, the overnight rates are typically lower than term rates. This slide is a visual showing you the higher LIBOR rate, being the large red arrow at the top, compared to the lower small arrows depicting the lower overnight rates for the risk-free rates. These lower overnight rates will be compounded over that interest period. The higher LIBOR rate include the credit risk element, and the lower RFRs absent of any term credit risk element. Next slide, thanks, Lisa. This slide just helps us to visualize exactly what that CAS is, being the difference between the term rate like LIBOR and the overnight RFR. And this is reflected as that yellow cylinder on the right-hand side that was there but disappeared, but now it's back. Okay, so next slide, thanks, Lisa. Okay, this slide depicts what we ultimately will end up with after a transition where equivalence has been achieved. In a transition, equivalence is achieved by changing from a term rate to an RFR, and a new all-in rate is created consisting of that new base rate, being the RFR, and the CAS plus the margin. The ultimate rate should be very similar to the pre-transition position, which was based on LIBOR plus the margin. And this will be in line with the ultimate goal being economic equivalence for both parties. So let's look on the next slide how the CAS is calculated. We know that in the derivatives market, ISDA consulted on and landed on the 5-year historical median approach, where the CAS, in instances where LIBOR ceases to exist, is the median difference or spread between the LIBOR in respect of the relevant interest period and the RFR, calculated over the previous 5-year period. It was helpfully also agreed that Bloomberg Index Services Limited will calculate and publish the spread for each interest period. You may have heard people referring to the BSIL CAS or the ISDA CAS. They're simply referring to this 5-year median approach as consulted on by ISDA and published by Bloomberg. So what about your loans in the cash markets? The Sterling Risk-Free Rate Working Group consulted on this, and the outcome was that the majority of the respondents favored the same approach as ISDA in instances where LIBOR permanently ceases. But what if you transition your agreement, and this can actually be a loan or a derivative, before cessation of that relevant LIBOR benchmark? When do you calculate your CAS? At the date you enter into the transition or amendment contract, or on the date when you switch to the RFR at a later date? And also, do you calculate your CAS? If not, how do you calculate your CAS if you're not going to use it on the ISDA or the BSIL CAS? So the current approach for market participants is to decide on a case-by-case basis. And that is a key part of our message to you today. Be aware that there are different ways to calculate this CAS. Basing it on the ISDA CAS is not the only way. There's also the forward approach where pricing is based off the forward curves. And I'll leave this for Ross to explain to you a bit later, the difference in value this may cause when calculating CAS based on forward curves or as opposed to basing it on the ISDA CAS. And our recommendation really should be that you should be familiar with this when you start negotiating with your transition counterpart. You should know the options and the conventions, and that would help you to be better prepared to transition your transaction. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Lisa. You can go to the next slide. Let's have a look at what the Australian industry lending documentation, where are they at? We know that for derivatives, we have the benefit of the ISDA supplement and the protocol, and we've had webinars on those before, so I'm not going into detail on that today. But for lending, we can't rely on a protocol or a supplement and a master agreement, and we must negotiate our agreements on a case-by-case basis. Of course, transition is made much easier where industry bodies like the LMA and APLMA provide us with recommended form loan agreements. In the UK, the LMA kicked off with the new industry agreements, and to date have published quite a few agreements, being rate switch documentation as well as new RFR facility documentation. These are already in a recommended form, which replaced the earlier exposure drafts, and are all available on their website. In Australia, to date, we only have one exposure draft of the rate switch agreement. And moving away from the LMA, the Australian agreement includes also only the look back without observation shift as the RFR convention in that agreement. The LMA created two different drafts, one based on look back with observation shift and one without. But the Australian Documentations Committee, likely at the benefit of the lending market seeming to move towards look back without observation shift, at the time that they started drafting their agreement, and they decided that the look back without observation shift was the most likely convention to be followed in this market. And if parties needed different drafting, then the LMA documents could always be consulted and followed. We're expecting the APLMA to issue their recommended form as opposed to only the exposure draft of the rate switch agreement in the near future, together with a term sheet. And I believe that they're also working on RFR facility documentation, but these will follow only once they've issued the term sheet and the next draft of the rate switch agreement. So which conventions do the LMA and the APLMA agreements use in relation to an RFR? The APLMA document is based on the LMA document, and the LMA document in turn is based on the UK Sterling Risk-Free Rate Working Group recommendations for the SONIA loan market conventions. Both the LMA and APLMA specifically state that in the absence of established market or operational practice in relation to loan market conventions, their agreements do not purport to offer any standardized position in relation to a number of issues associated with the use of compounded RFRs or the operation of conventions relating thereto. What does this mean? It means that in order to get a draft industry loan document out in the market, the drafting was based on the recommendations in relation to RFR conventions made by the Sterling Risk-Free Rate Working Group. However, by including it in the draft agreements, neither the LMA nor the APLMA is offering a standardized position, and you are free to consider any of the drafting and recommendations and see what suits your operational abilities best. Settled market practice, of course, will develop as the time goes, but the lending market is to an extent currently still being led by what can operationally be supported. So do your homework, understand the conventions, and understand what would suit your business best. So what's the difference between the rate switch documentation and the other RFR facility documentation? Well, a rate switch document is a document whereby the loan starts off on a forward-looking term rate like LIBOR, but then allowing a change at a later date to compounded RFRs, and that later date is either an agreed date or upon cessation of the existing reference rate. So basically you start off on your LIBOR rate, but then you switch to an RFR at a later date. The RFR facility documentation, on the other hand, deals with day one RFRs, where you don't start with a forward-looking term rate, but you start with your RFR from day one. Of course, in the absence of RFR facility documentation in Australia, the rate switch agreement is currently also used in Australia to include day one RFR lending. In that instance, the date for the conversion or the switch is simply included as the day one date. It's expected that this practice will fall away once the day one RFR documentation have been released. It's also likely that we will have combinations of new RFR lending and rate switch in one agreement going forward, and we expect that this will look similar to the LMA recommended form agreement, including both RFRs as well as forward-looking term rates and switch provisions. And why do I say this will be the case in Australia? Because banks are requested by the regulators to follow international working group recommended timelines as to when to stop writing loans linked to certain benchmarks. For example, the Sterling Risk-Free Rate Working Group recommended no further sterling LIBOR lending from 30 April this year. And this means that if you have the multi-currency facility for AUD, sterling, and a USD LIBOR, for example, you will have a forward-looking term rate for your AUD BBSY component, A day one RFR facility for the sterling component, as we can no longer write new sterling LIBOR loans, and then also a US dollar LIBOR component with potentially switch provisions if you can't commit to SOFR from day one. And again, I recommend anyone involved with the loan market or having loan agreements that you have to transition to be familiar with these agreements. Even if you've decided to transition only later in the year, the LMA have published very valuable commentary to these agreements, and it will provide you with a good background and knowledge, which will stand you in good stead when you negotiate your transitions in the future. And onto the next slide, which is the last slide for me. It's important to know that both the LMA and the APLMA do not prescribe how the CAS should be dealt with, and none of their agreements make any recommendations as to how or when the CAS should be calculated. This is left completely for commercial decision between the parties, and it can either be agreed at the time you sign your switch agreement or at a future switch date, for example. If it's delayed to only be agreed at a later switch date, this will result in that agreement being amended again, may be costly, and it's also uncertain for the parties concerned. So potentially consider if it's best to agree the manner of how your CAS will be calculated at this stage. So again, a reminder, familiarize yourself with the ways in which the CAS can be calculated as the slide shows, based on a 5-year historical mean or the forward curves. The agreements do not prescribe this, and when you transition your loan or your derivative before cessation, discuss with your counterparty what's the most appropriate for you. So that's all for me. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand you over to Ross now for a more in-depth look at these topics.
Thank you very much, Nelda. And thank you, Nathan and Lisa, for those earlier introductions. So I'm going to generally take people through two sort of broad areas that I think people should have be thinking about, starting to get their minds around, particularly as we are concerned about parties leaving their transition decision-making until later in the year if they need to make it. And the two broad areas are around, firstly, the conventions that are arising, and secondly, around the deal pricing, but with specific focus on that credit adjustment spread element that Nelda just took us through. That credit adjustment spread probably needs to be thought of in the overall package of your thinking about pricing, but I'll get to that reasonably shortly. But to start with conventions, I think it's fair to say that we're moving from a fairly fixed and well-known, well-established process under LIBOR to a fairly sort of giant box of Lego kind of situation that's emerging with many, many different approaches that could be taken, multiple different benchmarks potentially coming into the space. But in particular with conventions, it's going to be really important for people to consider whether the convention that they're going towards is suitable for their needs, and whether something that might hedge, for instance, a cash product, is able to be efficiently hedged with a derivative to match. So I'm going to take you through 3 of the conventions that have evolved. Now, the first 2 of those really are fairly new conventions, and I'm going to take you through some quirks related to those. The third one, and that's at the bottom of your screen, that's payment delayed or lagged. So while those 3 are all available within the NAB suite of products, I have to make it very clear that it's only the first 2 of those, that's the simple look back and the observation shifted look back, that are available within our loans and derivatives, but payment delay is only available in our derivative suite. Really crucially, NAB has spent a great deal of time and energy and effort putting together a comprehensive product suite that includes the types of products that are important in finance, of course, and markets, with the relevant conventions. So I'd urge you, once you've thought through your convention requirements, to give some thought to reaching out to your bankers and engaging on your needs. So if we start with the simple look back, I should just describe here for a brief moment that the little rectangles in each of these diagrams are designed to give you a simple view of what's moving or where the maths is happening. The crucial thing in all of these is that the interest period doesn't really change from the interest period that was inside your instruments or your products under LIBOR. It's just that the calculations or the rates that are being drawn in are going to have some differences to them. And of course, as Nelda pointed out, they're going to be compounded daily with calculations made in arrears. And as you can see on the visual we have here, under the simple look back, what you would be getting under simple look back is that instead of picking up overnight rates, and let's just use the example here of a 30-day calendar day instrument with 20 business days, you'd be picking up the interest rate observations within that process from T-5 or 5 business days prior to the start of the interest period. The key thing that goes with that and that interest period is that finance has found a way to bring forward payments that are related to the RFR process into alignment with what you were getting or what your requirements were under LIBOR itself. It's just that the calculation has to be created and passed off to customers. And I'm going to take you through some of the facets now that make this simple look back quite an attractive approach. So if we just jump into the elements that go with it, the first of those elements is that there's a 5-day offset. That's a 5-day banking day. So many of the deals on the corporate finance space that we are seeing are coming through with that 5-day banking look back. What's interesting though, is that the dates that are coming in via your observations, the structure of those dates are subtly different from the structure of the dates of the calculation period. Now that makes it a little bit interesting, and I'll explain why that's a facet in just a moment. But people need to be aware that once they move across to a facility or a derivative that has the simple look back feature, it does have that offset period. Now under a 5-day simple look back, what's really attractive about it is that on the 15th business day, you get to find out the rate on the 16th business day. You can calculate the interest obligation, and a payment requirement can be sent to a customer or to a competing party, requiring payment to be made at the end of the interest period. So it's LIBOR-like, but it's not LIBOR. The key thing is that the Federal Reserve and their Alternate Reference Rate Committee, the Bank of England and its Sterling Working Group, both recommended simple look back as their first recommendation or their most recommended approach to the problem of compounding in arrears. So one other thing to note, other than the attractiveness of it being, giving you time to make a payment 3 or 4 days out, if you happen to live very close to the international date line and you're borrowing US dollars, that could be an important feature for you. What it does is that those observation periods are nicely aligned. So the nice alignment there is that a Monday in the interest rate structure would match up to the Monday in the interest calculation. Fridays likewise, and every other day, of course. The question then is what happens when a holiday intervenes? And I'm going to talk about that some more in just a moment when we go to observation shifted lookbacks. So under the observation shifted look back, pretty much everything is the same in terms of 5-day offset for the observations. But what you'll notice is that calculation period and the date structure of the calculation period has been shifted to align to the observations. And that's really crucial if you feel that you need to perfectly match cash flows around things like Easter or Christmas. Again, the date for calculation is important. The payment date itself is going to come in and be aligned to the end of the interest period again. Nice conformity there with the simple look back. And again, you've got 3 or 4 days, depending on where you happen to be based, prior to the end of the interest period. So this was the second recommendation after simple lookbacks. I have to say we were a little bit surprised that this wasn't their first recommendation, but nonetheless, the Bank of England and the Fed are far more important in the grand scheme of things, and they did recommend simple lookbacks. Under observation shifted lookbacks, there's that firm alignment, Mondays to Mondays, Fridays to Fridays. If there were a very large rate movement on a Friday, of course, that's typically got a 3-day week weighting in the calcs. But what happens if there's a very large move on the Thursday prior to Easter? Under observation shifted lookbacks, that would be accurately calculated within the calculation date structure. So essentially the difference between simple lookbacks and observation shifted lookbacks only comes into play when there's an intervening holiday. Otherwise, they'll give the same answer. How big a difference would there be between those two? Well, it's very hard for us to say. It probably requires a very large move in interest rates. So if we turn to the ISDA form of observation shifted lookbacks, this is where instead of that 5-day process, ISDA, and let's remember they've done a wonderful job at ISDA getting us prepared for this transition, particularly fallbacks in the derivative markets. But under the ISDA terms and under the protocol, and certainly for new deals that follow the supplement since January the 26th, what you'll find is that consultation took the ISDA down a pathway, yes, to observation shifted, but only to a 2-day offset. Now, whether that makes a difference for you or not, it's just worth you noting that if you're someone who has a loan, perhaps you have some form of hedge against that loan, it's going to be a different convention if your hedging instrument follows the ISDA process. The calculation can really only be calculated on day 19, so really only giving you 1 day prior to the end of the interest period. But I guess it is important that they did go down that observation shifted process. So you can see already in that Lego box that I talked about at the very start, here's another piece of the puzzle, or here's another piece of Lego, I guess, and it's different to simple look back, and it's different to what we're seeing in loan markets. So if we move now to simple look back versus the ob shift under the ISDA, the things that are going to be different, well, of course, you've got 2 days under the ISDA, 5 days under the simple look back for a SATS loan or some other instrument. Well, they are going to give you different outcomes. The tracking of the observations are going to be different. That is also probably going to create moments of difference. I should mention that the Bank of England, in providing material to the market to look at on these particular topics, looked at simple lookbacks on a reasonably large deal. I think it was around about 90 million sterling pounds over the course of a full year, looked at observation shifted versus simple look back over the course of 2019 and found that it didn't make a great deal of difference. I think the number was less than £2 different. The caveat with that is we may not have seen very big differences in rates over that period or the holiday structure. So it's really hard for anyone to put an accurate number on that. What I like about the fact that the ISDA has gone the way it has is that it does allow for payments to be made crucially on that same business day. For cash flow alignment, that seems fairly crucial, but of course, we are not accountants. For people wanting to get a better handle on whether things are going to hedge perfectly, they really do need to think about speaking with their auditors or their accounting firms. So if we look at simple look back versus the traditional overnight index swap products that are available, well, again, we get those differences. Again, it's going to be for example, where the observations are important, the observation under the simple 5-day look back, well, it's 5-day different. There is no offset under the traditional overnight index swap market. The OIS market, again, is an OBS shifted type of market. Calc period and OBS period match up. So, of course, you're going to get a bit of a difference there. And then there's another annoying piece of the Lego puzzle here. And that's the point, the payment delay, well, it's delayed. And of course, if you've got a cash product, you want payment matching, traditional standard overnight index swap conventions are going to make that somewhat problematic because they are delayed payments. I did mention earlier that NAB has not created payment delay on the lending side. The crucial element there is, and we haven't seen any demand, I should say also, we haven't seen any real demand for payment delayed structures, is that under payment delay, in a sense, there is an increased extension of risk because interest payments don't match up to the end of the interest period. All banks know that that would create a slight difference in risk-weighted assets. And so I guess at this stage, we can be thankful that there really hasn't been a jump into payment delayed lending, but it is the dominant convention in the traditional market for overnight index swaps. Just be aware of that. So I guess if we wanted to move to Lego perfection, well, there's a number of ways that you can go forward. I guess crucially on the way forward is to look at, we've got a little bit of a problem there of a battery that looks like it's okay now, to look at your hedged item, whatever it might be, speak to your banker, and if they've been working to build up commensurate product capability, you should be able to talk to them about an appropriate hedge that follows the conventions. And here's, I guess, Nirvana, where we've just created a situation to demonstrate NAB is able to, in most cases, particularly across our corporate finance suite, right across our linear products and some of our non-linear in the derivative suite, we are able to create virtually cash flow aligning hedges that follow the same convention that you might choose in the item you're looking to hedge, and certainly where payment alignment at the end of the interest period can be brought forth. That all seems like a fairly important thing to us, but it really is up to individual customers to think through what they need. And we'd urge you to give some thought to it all and speak to your banker. We put a lot of effort into building up a large capability within our product suite. So if we move now across to the pricing side of things, I'm going to give you a bit of an example here that should be, I hope, a bit thought-provoking. The numbers that I'm going to show you, I don't want anyone to hold me to them. They may be a couple of days old. And on this particular graphic, I'm going to be talking in terms of yield and yield curves. Crucially, remember, I'm talking yield here. I'm not talking about basis risk. But at the moment, and we're talking, let's say, US dollars, there is an ongoing and observable US dollar yield curve. That's still available after the end of the year. Well, it'll be interesting about whether you can get a product on it, but it is still observable. Under SOFR, at the same time, there is a SOFR yield curve and it exists. And it's very active and it's starting to build into more activity. And I'm sure the Federal Reserve is looking for it to do even more. If we move across to how those are priced though, and I've provided here a whole suite of different rates in terms of tenors, what you'll notice is that the SOFR rates, and as Nelda pointed out, generally overnight rates, when compounded up into different tenors, give you what tend to be lower rates. Now that hasn't always been the case. There are exceptions to this, but this is about a week's old pricing. And if we move to the differences, you'll see that right across the yield curves, it doesn't really matter the tenor. If you look, and I should specify here that this is for 90-day rolling instruments, what you'll find if you go and look up the BISL handbook, the 90-day rolling instruments after the cessation effective date in dollar LIBOR will roll at 26.16 basis points. Well, every single tenor on the particular graphic I'm showing you here, regardless of tenor, rolling at 90 days, they are all lower than the BISL that was established on the pre-cessation moment that Nelda talked about back on the 5th of March. Now, if we look at this a little bit differently and look at it in terms of basis, What I mean by basis is the difference between rolling under LIBOR versus rolling under SOFR. There's a different curve to look at here, but just stick with me and I'll explain. The cessation effective date is crucial to think about. That'll become more apparent in a moment. That's the date at which any derivative that's currently rolling on LIBOR will start rolling on the basis of the ISDA fallback. And on a 90-day instrument, as I said, that will roll every 90 days with the 26.16 basis points embedded in the rate. But if you were a borrower, well, isn't there an incentive, given the shape of yield curves at the moment, to continue to roll under LIBOR? We have to leave that up to everyone to think through for themselves. But the 3-month roll at the moment looks like it's about 12 odd basis points difference between LIBOR. Of course, once we get past the cessation effective date, you would start to roll your facility floating on SOFR with 26.16 added as the credit adjustment spread, the CAS, the BISL in this particular example, as described by Nelda. So if we think back to those rates that I gave you earlier, and they were all reasonably current prices, what I think is important to think through here are your choices. We have seen customers consider moving straight to BISL rates, even for US dollar instruments. And if we just move forward to the next slide, what you'll find is that the Bank of England made it clear that not everybody had to move under the ISDA process, which is that 5-year historic median. In fact, every word on this particular slide is coming from Bank of England guidance that came out in December. And they basically said, lenders and borrowers need to determine the approach to active transition, including the credit adjustment spread, factoring in the costs, risks, and benefits of any options, and the information available to them at the time. And I guess you'd say some of this presentation would constitute information that's available. So what they said was, you could use that 5-year historic median, perhaps you could use the BISL, or you might consider using a forward approach. And they put the caveat that prior to sterling LIBOR permanently ceasing or becoming unrepresentative, which we know will be at the cessation effective date 31 Dec this year for sterling, a historical median, in other words, the BISL, does not necessarily represent the market expectation of the future difference between sterling LIBOR and SONIA. Now, what they're pointing to is this. If you were to immediately go to the BISL, you are free to do so, and your bankers could easily negotiate with you on that basis. In a sense, you'd be moving into the ISDA approach to fallback terms now. And that's that 5-year historical median that the Bank of England thought was fine. Under that, you'd be moving to an adjustment spread of 26.16 for 90-day rolling dollars, if your facility happened to be dollars. But what if you moved on the basis of forward pricing? Well, I'm not putting up any rates here because I think it's important for people to just get the effect of the visual. It does seem worthwhile to speak to your bankers and consider these two approaches and what works for you. It may be that some thought around this would be important. The current moves in interest rates by central banks, very much flooding the front of yield curves, have really changed the dynamics of the market. And the fact that the US dollar cessation date has been pushed out to June 30, 2023, make us think it's important to consider this at the very least. So the two real important messages here are about conventions, making sure that you're thinking through your conventions, but also that cessation effective date. If you're negotiating to move ahead of the cessation effective date, give some thought to the credit adjustment spread. It's possible that your bankers will consider the forward approach. If you're moving on the cessation effective date under one of the agreements that Nelda described earlier, perhaps it's a switch, then it seems that the 5-year historical median is becoming a market standard. National Australia Bank's not going to dictate that. Market practice probably will. but I think it's reasonable to think of that cessation effective date crucially when the time comes to think about pricing. And thank you for your attention. I'm going to hand over back to Nathan, and he's going to take you through what you need to do.
Great, thanks, Ross. And it's great to see you embracing the PowerPoint animation. Good proof that you can teach an old dog new tricks. But seriously, Ross, really good to get across some of those technical components of the transition, but avoiding the 11th hour crush is really going to be all about action. So I want to take a bit of a look now at what we need to do between now and the end of the year. And to kick that off, first, I thought it might be worthwhile having a look at the journey that we've been on at NAB in working through our transition plan and getting ready for LIBOR cessation. It's a journey that started for us back in 2018 when we took our first paper to board. And I still remember the air getting sucked out of the room as I kind of took the board through the $1.7 trillion of LIBOR exposure that NAB Group has or had at the time, and the plan for transition. And that's was largely focused in our markets business, but was really across group treasury as well and across the broader corporate institutional business. And there's even some small components that sit within our business bank connected with trade activity with importers and exporters. And I think that's a fair position to expect. LIBOR has been kind of embedded in the construction of interest rates for the better part of 50 years. And so it is really infiltrated into the banking business and across most businesses. And so we've spent the best part of the last 2.5 years working through all of new RFR products for our lending, for our market derivative products, and for our trade products. We've had to look through all of our legal contracts that Nelda has outlined, changes to systems and technology to accommodate risk-free rates, looking at our payment processes and the way that we manage our products, looking at the way that we measure risk and our model valuations for the positions that we've got, understanding the accounting impacts and the tax treatment, the investments that we've got and how they've been impacted, and then the impacts on our wealth business as well, and looking at the new ways to fund the bank and manage our balance sheet risks. So it is fairly far-reaching, and while I hope you don't have that much complexity in your business, I think over the last couple of years I've learned not to underestimate the breadth of areas that LIBOR may be embedded in nooks and crannies across your organisation. Just move to the next slide. I think there's kind of 3 key steps that you need to take when you're looking at what to do around making the transition. The first step, and it's really, you should have a pretty good handle on this by now, but it's looking at what your current exposure is to LIBOR and what are those touch points. There's a good list there on the left hand of this slide that kind of goes through all the areas that I've just kind of walked through. There's 2 additional points that I'd make. One around intercompany loans, and particularly where you've got foreign subsidiaries. Now, we've been working with a number of customers to understand their risk-free rate impacts on those intercompany loans and the considerations they need to think about in transitioning those. And the other key point, I think, is around third-party contracts, looking at long-dated asset purchase agreements, where delays in build of equipment can result in price variations that are often connected with LIBOR. And the other piece is in long-dated supply agreements, particularly in the commodity space, where changes to contracted volumes of supply or demand may result in changes in price impacts, which are connected to LIBOR as well. And these become particularly difficult negotiations when there's material difference to current pricing, to what's current market pricing, to what is contracted under those agreements. I think it's also critical to understand what happens in your existing contracts when LIBOR ceases. What is that current fallback language, and is that relevant anymore? Because doing nothing is an option, but it needs to be an informed choice. And in the majority of cases, it can be particularly risky. and I'll expand on this a little bit further in a few moments. But I think that the other part here is to understand the operational components, understand where LIBOR touches your systems, the data feeds, your payment processes and settlements, how they'll work through, any legal documentation issues you've got, and accounting and risk and tax implications for your business, and always worthwhile getting independent external advice when looking at those issues. Step one's all about understanding your impacts on your business. Step two is all about education. And so, really here it's about coming to events like the one you've got here today, understanding the what, the why, and the how. Your benchmarks are changing. Those critical points, around tax and accounting, and get external advice and understand your positions. I'm sure your lawyers and accountants will only be too happy to help. And I think that the other point here is that there is a wealth of information out there from regulators, from their working groups, and from other market participants who've all got pretty active websites that provide a lot of information. And we've noted a few there that'll help you get across a lot of the key issues. Step three is really about now it's time to make some decisions around what are the best options for your business. And I think there's sort of 5 clear options for consideration. The first one's around ISDA fallbacks. The ISDA protocol outlines LIBOR cessation trigger events. It adopts the 2-day observation convention and the calculation of interest. And then the third part is it adopts the BISL for the credit adjustment spread. NAB has adhered to the ISDA protocols and will adopt this with any other market participants who also want to take on those ISDA protocols. The second option is really around a non-ISDA fallback, and this is a bespoke solution for your derivatives which you want to match to your underlying exposure. I suspect quite a number of people on the call will want to consider this so they can match out the derivatives to their loan agreements, where you can really match up the triggers, the interest calculation conventions, and credit adjustment spread, and get a neat hedge that Ross was talking through. The third option then is, amend or terminate your loan contracts and enter into a new risk-free rate trade. Adopting SONIA and SOFR with their daily compounding components and the other primary RFR benchmarks, and just being mindful of any termination impacts and seeking independent advice to make sure you understand the tax and accounting impacts there. The fourth option is really around amending or terminating or entering into other benchmark trades. And we've started to see BSBY, Ameribor and Term, SOFR and SONIA rates start to emerge. In these cases, they're really picking up some of the term characteristics that we see in LIBOR, or matching some of the bank credit components that we see under LIBOR at the moment. Really important to understand those termination impacts again and get independent advice, but also understand how those rates may operate in different market conditions, the complexities that you might have in hedging those rates, and what the tax and accounting impacts will be. And the fourth, as I mentioned, is to do nothing. Understand those fallbacks that you've got in place at the moment, understand how they impact your business and how they will work for you. But just noting that in the majority of cases, this may be fairly risky, as some of those fallback provisions won't exist in the future and those rates won't be there. I think with transition, it's really critical to kind of look at and prioritise your activity based around the LIBOR cessation timeline. And we'll focus on that on the next slide, where we kind of look at some of those cessation dates and key to kind of work through your action plan sooner rather than later. So looking at the current state of play and where we are today, at the end of December, as we've outlined, LIBOR will cease to be published for a number of key rates. Sterling LIBOR on overnight 1 week 2-month and 12-month positions. The Ionia and Swiss LIBOR, all 7 settings are going. Yen LIBOR, spot next 1 week, 2-month and 12-month, and US dollar LIBOR 1 week and 2-month will all kind of cease to be published. The publication of a synthetic LIBOR for sterling and some of the yen positions is yet to be confirmed by the respective central banks. However, we expect that if that does come to fruition, it will be for very limited application and for some tough legacy positions. And we'll see that kick in at the end of December. In March of next year, SIBOR 6-month will cease. And we note that we've already started to see some of the new SORA loans. We wrote our first deal in SORA a couple of weeks ago. So we are starting to see some pickup of some of the new rates starting to emerge. In June 2023 is obviously quite a big date where the Singapore swap offer rate will cease. And the remaining tranches of US dollar LIBOR will cease, which is going to be a huge event. And there'll be a lot of activity again in the lead up to that date. And then finally, the remaining tranches of SIBOR will finish in December 2023. So please consider the timeline as you prioritise your transactions and the exposures that you've got. Start to think about moving sooner rather than later as we inevitably try to avoid this 11th hour crush in the 4th quarter of this year. Please take the opportunity to speak with your relationship managers, to commence any discussions on exposures that you might like to have assistance with, either NAB exposures you have with NAB or with other organisations. And of course, myself and the whole NAB team are also available and happy to be involved and to talk through some of the risks you might be facing or ways you might want to tailor an approach. That brings us to the end of our formal presentation, and I'd like to open it up to the questions. Any questions that you might have, please post on the Q&A function, and I'll hand it over to Lisa, who can help us coordinate with the panel.
Thanks,
Lisa.
Nathan. And we do have a few questions here. I know we've only got a few minutes, so we'll try and get those across very quickly. So we have one here from Peter Williams. Currently looking to establish a new letter of credit trade finance facility, and has been advised by the trade team that we are still issuing new documentation referencing LIBOR. What benchmark and timing is applicable for trade products, and is there standard documentation language to highlight the transition to RFR?
Yeah, I think on the trade piece, markets are really looking for term offerings, term RFR to kind of come into place. I think on US dollars in particular, where we see a lot of trade activity, the ARC haven't endorsed fully. It looks like CME will be the CME term. SOFR will be the winner in that space. They've been announced as the admin agent, but they want to see more liquidity picking up in SOFR before they endorse a term SOFR product. We're hopeful we'll see that in the 4th quarter of this year. So we are writing LIBOR transactions until we get clarity on that term SOFR position.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Now we've got another question here. If you have an interest rate swap linked to a LIBOR reference rate dollar loan, do you need to take a further instrument to match the different look-back terms, or another swap like to SOFR? I might hand that one to Ross. Ross, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, it's a good question, Stephanie, and thank you for the question. I did partially cover this in the material earlier around conventions. I don't believe that you need to take a further instrument itself, but I do believe you do need to think through, well, the LIBOR loan is going to be hard to do or hard to transact on under overnight index swap styled swaps. So you'll probably need to go with some sort of look back, the 5-day look back being very common, as I mentioned, and then look to switch the derivative, if you've got a hedge against it already, to switch that to SOFR. I should make the point, we think that's quite challenging if you're looking to preserve a certain fixed rate, by all means, reach out to your NAB banker and we can get into a discussion for you on that particular topic. It does look quite challenging to preserve those fixed rates for reasons that we probably don't have time to go into on this call. So please feel free to reach out.
And I note there's a question from Stephen Reid, and Stephen, I'm sure Ross would love to have a chat to you about that one. It's a very hot topic. But I'm going to ask a quick question to Nelda. Nelda, there was an option that Nathan mentioned to do nothing. So why is it risky to do nothing? And are there any concerns from a legal perspective that any of our customers should have if they choose to do nothing?
I think that if you do nothing, it has to be an informed do nothing. You cannot make a decision to do nothing and then blissfully be unaware what's any content of your agreement. I think if you do, so that's the first thing. The second thing is if you do nothing, that means you don't have the opportunity to potentially line up how you, if you transition, for example, these swaps and loans at the same time, you could make sure that you could still, have an efficient hedge, or, make sure that you line up your transactions that they still match together. If you do nothing, you fall into the category where these things will start falling over to different rates that you don't have control over. For example, a loan could fall over to cost of funds. You've got no idea what that is. How's that going to work with your hedge? You won't even know month to, interest period to interest period, what that's going to be. There might be derivatives where the fallback rate is the calculation agent to go out and get reference bank rates. They may not find reference banks. What will be the rate? What will happen to your derivative? So it is, I think the do nothing scenario for me is really, not to contradict Nathan, but it's really, it depends on really your exposure. And I think for me could potentially only really be the issuers, those issuers of notes who it's really, really difficult to amend those notes because of the vast numbers of note holders that they may have. They may be in that category of do nothing but even for them, if they do nothing, they know that rate, the majority of those documents will fall over to a historic, so the historic interest rate, so they have sort of an idea where it's going to go. It's not quite the same as cost of funds. So yeah, that's why I think it's risky.
Great. All right. I might just, given the time, just pull things to a halt there. And thanks everybody. There will be a short survey if you can hold on at the end of the presentation, and that's really helpful feedback for us in crafting future sessions like this for you. And finally, a big thank you from everyone here at NAB for your continued support and business. Hopefully you found today's presentation informative. Please speak with your relationship managers on how you want to discuss how we can help you further. And thank you and have a great afternoon.